The year is 1956, the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas is packed to capacity, the air thick with cigarette smoke and anticipation, and on that legendary stage stands the man who would become the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, completely unaware that sitting in the front row is one of the most dangerous men in America, a mobster with connections so deep they could bury a man without a trace. And this isn't just any performance, because what happened that night would become one of the most whispered about incidents in entertainment history, a moment when rock and roll royalty collided head-on with organized crime, and the only thing standing between Elvis and potential disaster was the quick thinking of another legend, Dean Martin, whose street-smart instincts and unshakable cool would turn a potentially deadly situation into a masterclass in handling pressure, under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Now, before we dive into the heart of this incredible story, if you're fascinated by the untold stories of Elvis Presley, the moments that shaped the legend beyond the music and the movies, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we bring you the stories that history almost forgot, the real moments behind the icon, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next on this channel. But right now, let's take you back to that fateful night when everything hung in the balance and Elvis's life might have taken a very different turn. The story actually begins several weeks before that explosive confrontation at the Sands, back when Elvis was still riding the initial wave of his meteoric rise to fame, when Heartbreak Hotel was dominating the airwaves and teenage girls were fainting at his concerts while their parents worried that his hip-shaking performances were corrupting America's youth. But what most people didn't know was that Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had been making deals left and right to get his boy into the most prestigious venues in the country, and Las Vegas in 1956 was the crown jewel of American entertainment, a place where careers were made or broken in a single night, where the biggest names in show business commanded stages and audiences with an authority that came from years of perfecting their craft. Elvis was young, raw, and revolutionary, everything that traditional Vegas audiences weren't quite ready for. But the Colonel saw opportunity where others saw risk, and he'd secured Elvis a 2-week engagement at the new Frontier Hotel, which didn't go exactly as planned because the crowd of middle-aged vacationers and high rollers weren't prepared for rock and roll. They wanted Sinatra, they wanted smooth crooners and big band sounds, not this young kid from Memphis gyrating and growling his way through rhythm and blues numbers that made them uncomfortable in their seats, and the reviews were brutal, absolutely savage, with one critic calling him a white Marlon Brando singing jungle rhythm music. But here's what you need to understand about Elvis: he wasn't the type to let failure define him. He learned from it. He adapted, and more importantly, he made connections during those 2 weeks that would prove crucial to his survival, including befriending a cocktail waitress named Dorothy, who happened to mention that some very important and very dangerous men frequented these establishments, men who didn't appreciate disrespect, men who controlled everything from the liquor licenses to the talent bookings, men whose handshake could launch a career or whose displeasure could end it permanently. Fast forward 6 months and Elvis's star had exploded beyond anyone's wildest predictions. He'd appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show not once but 3 times, with the final appearance drawing over 60 million viewers. He'd recorded multiple hit singles, and suddenly Las Vegas wanted him back, but this time on very different terms. This time the Sands Hotel came calling. Jack Intrater himself, the legendary entertainment director who'd brought everyone from Frank Sinatra to Dean Martin to that stage, personally extended the invitation because he recognized that Elvis represented something unstoppable, a cultural shift that couldn't be ignored, and Intrater knew how to read the room better than anyone. He understood that the younger audiences with money to spend were starting to flood into Vegas, and they wanted to see Elvis Presley, they wanted rock and roll, they wanted to witness history being made right before their eyes. The Sands was different from the New Frontier. It was the hippest joint on the Strip. It was where the Rat Pack performed, where presidents and movie stars mingled with showgirls and high-stakes gamblers, where the cream of society rubbed shoulders with characters whose business dealings existed in the shadows, and everyone understood the unspoken rules. You showed respect, you minded your own business, and you never, ever caused problems for the people who really ran things, the silent partners whose names never appeared on paperwork but whose influence permeated every decision made in that town built in the middle of the desert on dreams and darker realities. Dean Martin was already a fixture at the Sands by this point. He'd performed there countless times. He knew every waiter, every pit boss, every cocktail waitress by name, and more importantly, he knew the players, the real power brokers who operated behind the scenes, men like Sam Giancana who ran Chicago, men like Johnny Rosselli who controlled the West Coast rackets, men whose approval you needed if you wanted to work steady in Las Vegas, and Dean had that approval because he understood something fundamental that Elvis didn't yet grasp. You could be the biggest star in the world, but in Vegas, you were a guest in someone else's house, and guests who forgot that lesson sometimes found themselves without a stage to stand on, or worse. Now Dean had heard that Elvis was coming to the Sands, and he was genuinely excited because, unlike some of the old guard who dismissed rock and roll as a passing fad, Dean recognized talent when he saw it. He appreciated Elvis's raw charisma, his genuine love for music, and he'd even defended the kid in conversations with other entertainers who'd written him off as a flash in the pan. So when he heard through the grapevine that Elvis's opening night was shaping up to be a major event with every seat sold and people scalping tickets outside for 3 times face value, Dean made sure to clear his schedule so he could be there to show support, sitting right there in the audience like any other fan. Except Dean Martin sitting in a Las Vegas showroom was never just like any other fan. His presence meant something. It signaled approval. It told the industry that this young upstart had arrived. And it also meant that Dean would be watching carefully, not just the performance but the crowd, the reactions, the energy in the room, because he understood that Vegas crowds could turn on a performer in an instant if things went wrong. The night started perfectly. The showroom was electric with anticipation. Women in evening gowns and men in sharp suits filled every seat while others stood in the back hoping for a glimpse. The band was tight. The lighting was perfect. And when Elvis strode onto that stage in a gold lame jacket that caught the spotlights and threw them back at the audience, the reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. Screams erupted, cameras flashed, and for the first 40 minutes of his set, Elvis had that crowd eating out of the palm of his hand. He performed Hound Dog and they went wild. He slowed it down for Love Me Tender and you could have heard a pin drop. He joked between songs, showing a natural charisma that worked just as well with adults as it did with teenagers. And Dean, sitting 3 tables back from the stage with a bourbon in hand, smiled and nodded appreciatively because he recognized a master craftsman at work, someone who understood instinctively how to read a room and give them exactly what they needed. But then something shifted. You could feel it even before you could identify what it was, a change in the atmosphere, a tension that hadn't been there moments before. And Dean's smile faded slightly as his eyes tracked to a table right in front of the stage where a group of men in expensive suits sat, men whose body language screamed power and barely contained violence, men whose faces Dean recognized with a sinking feeling in his stomach because the guy in the center, the one with the cold eyes and the diamond pinky ring catching the light, was Frank Costello, one of the most feared mob bosses in America. A man whose criminal empire stretched from New York to Los Angeles with Las Vegas sitting right in his pocket, and Costello wasn't smiling. Here's what you need to understand about Frank Costello: he wasn't some two-bit gangster running numbers in Brooklyn. He was sophisticated, he wore custom Italian suits, he lived in a Central Park West penthouse, he hobnobbed with politicians and judges. But beneath that civilized veneer was a man who'd clawed his way to the top of the underworld through cunning and ruthlessness. A man who'd survived attempts on his life and turned enemies into cautionary tales, and he had very particular ideas. About respect, about how things should be done, about the natural order of the entertainment world he'd helped build with mob money. And right now, watching Elvis Presley command that stage with a confidence that bordered on arrogance in Costello's estimation, something about it was rubbing him entirely the wrong way. Elvis had no idea who was sitting in front of him. He was focused on his performance, feeding off the crowd's energy, and when he launched into his next number, he really let loose, shaking and moving in ways that would have gotten him arrested in half the states in America, and the crowd loved it. They absolutely ate it up, but Frank Costello's jaw tightened, his knuckles went white around his whiskey glass, and he leaned over to whisper something to the man next to him, something that made that man's eyes go wide before he nodded nervously, and Dean Martin, watching this exchange from his vantage point, felt his stomach drop because he'd seen that look before. That was the look that preceded violence, that preceded people disappearing, that preceded careers ending in the most permanent way possible. Elvis finished the song to thunderous applause and moved to the front of the stage, kneeling down to accept a scarf from a woman in the front row, which was a move he'd done 100 times before. A bit of showmanship that drove the ladies crazy, but in doing so, he inadvertently turned his back on Frank Costello's table, and in that moment, either not seeing or not caring about the breach of etiquette, Elvis stayed there at the edge of the stage, signing autographs, soaking up the adulation, completely unaware that behind him, Costello had stood up, his face flushed with anger, and Dean could read his lips from where he sat, could see him saying something about disrespect, about young punks who didn't know their place, about teaching lessons that wouldn't be forgotten, and the men at his table were standing too now, hands moving inside their jackets in ways that made Dean's blood run cold because he knew exactly what those movements meant. He'd grown up in Steubenville, Ohio, where mob guys were as common as factory workers. He knew the language, he knew the protocols, and he knew that Elvis Presley was about 30 seconds away from the biggest mistake of his short life, and he didn't even know it. The thing about Dean Martin that people often forget, blinded by his smooth singing voice and his comedy routines with Jerry Lewis and his seemingly effortless cool, was that underneath all that charm was a street-smart kid who'd boxed professionally as a teenager, who'd dealt blackjack in illegal gambling joints, who understood violence and danger in ways that most entertainers never would, and in that split second, watching Costello's hand start to move toward his inside pocket while his associates began to close in on the stage from different angles, Dean made a decision that would require every ounce of courage and quick thinking he possessed. He stood up from his table so fast that his chair scraped loudly against the floor, and he started walking toward the stage, not running, which would have caused a panic, but moving with purpose, with confidence, with the kind of authority that made people instinctively move out of his way. Now, if you're enjoying this story and you want to hear more incredible tales from Elvis's life, the moments of danger and triumph that shaped the king of rock and roll, do me a favor and hit that like button right now, and drop a comment telling me what you think Dean Martin did next, because I guarantee most of you won't see this coming. This is one of the most brilliant pieces of quick thinking in entertainment history, and it probably saved Elvis's life that night. So make sure you're Subscribe because we have so many more stories like this coming your way, stories that will blow your mind about the real Elvis Presley, not the sanitized version you read in most biographies, but the man who lived through extraordinary circumstances and somehow came out the other side. Now let's get back to that showroom where everything is about to explode. Dean reached the edge of the stage just as Costello was moving forward, just as his associates were positioning themselves strategically, and in a move that would become legendary among those who witnessed it. Dean didn't confront anyone, didn't acknowledge the threat, didn't even look at Costello directly. Instead he jumped up onto the stage mid-song, right in the middle of Elvis's performance, threw his arm around the young singer's shoulders, and started singing along with him, harmonizing perfectly, and the crowd went absolutely insane because this wasn't planned. This was Dean Martin, one of the biggest stars in the world, spontaneously joining Elvis Presley on stage, and the whole energy of the room shifted in an instant from potential violence to celebration, from confrontation to collaboration, and Elvis, confused but professional, played along, matching Dean's energy, and together they finished the song to a standing ovation that shook the building. But here's the genius of what Dean did. By jumping on stage, by making himself part of the performance, he'd effectively made it impossible for Costello to move against Elvis without also disrespecting Dean. And Dean Martin had juice in Vegas, serious juice. He was protected, he was loved, he brought money into every casino he played, and more importantly, he had relationships with made guys all over the country who would take it very personally if anything happened to him. So Costello found himself in a position where his anger at Elvis was suddenly complicated by the presence of someone he couldn't touch, someone whose interference he had to respect whether he wanted to or not, and Dean knew this. He'd calculated it in the seconds it took him to cross that showroom floor. He'd essentially used his own status as a human shield for a kid he barely knew but whose talent he recognized and whose life he wasn't going to let end in a Vegas showroom over a perceived slight that could be smoothed over with the right approach. When the song ended and the applause finally died down, Dean kept his arm around Elvis's shoulders and did something even more brilliant. He grabbed the microphone and addressed the crowd with that easy, casual charm that made everyone feel like they were in on the joke. He said something about how he couldn't resist joining in when he heard such great music, about how Elvis reminded him of when he was young and hungry and performing anywhere that would have him, about how it was important for the old guard to support the new generation because that's how you kept entertainment alive and vital. And while he was saying all this, seemingly just ad-libbing to the crowd, he was actually sending coded messages to everyone in that room who needed to hear them. He was telling Costello and his people that Elvis was under his protection, that any move against the kid would be seen as a move against Dean personally, but he was doing it in such a way that allowed Costello to save face, to step back without looking weak, because Dean was framing it as a generational thing, as the old guard passing the torch, not as one entertainer defending another against mob violence, and that distinction was crucial because it gave Costello an out, a way to retreat without his pride being damaged beyond repair. Elvis stood there taking all this in, still not entirely sure what had just happened but smart enough to recognize that something significant had shifted. He could feel the tension that had been building in the room starting to dissipate, could see the men in expensive suits at the front table settling back into their seats, could sense that Dean Martin had somehow just rescued him from something, though he wouldn't fully understand what until later when Jack Intrater pulled him aside after the show and explained in very clear terms about the near miss he'd just experienced, about who Frank Costello was, about what happens to people who show disrespect in Vegas, and about how Dean Martin had just performed a miracle of diplomacy that few people in the world could have pulled off. Dean finished his impromptu remarks, shook Elvis's hand, whispered something in his ear that made the young singer's eyes go wide, and then hopped off the stage with the same casual grace he'd shown jumping on it. He made his way back toward his table, but not before stopping at Costello's table, leaning down to shake hands with the mob boss, saying something quietly that made Costello's tight expression soften slightly, almost imperceptibly, and then nodding respectfully before continuing on his way. And in that brief interaction, he'd completed the de-escalation, he'd acknowledged Costello's status, he'd shown respect, he'd essentially apologized on Elvis's behalf without actually apologizing, and he'd done it all so smoothly that most people in the audience had no idea they'd just witnessed one of the most masterful pieces of conflict resolution in Vegas history. Elvis somehow managed to finish his set, though his performance had lost some of its carefree abandon, replaced by a new awareness of how dangerous the world he was entering could really be, and when he finally left the stage to thunderous applause, his hands were shaking, his gold lame jacket soaked through with sweat that had nothing to do with the stage lights and everything to do with the adrenaline crash of a crisis narrowly averted, and waiting for him backstage was Dean Martin, now flanked by Jack Intrater and a couple of other Vegas veterans who understood exactly what had almost happened out there. What Dean told Elvis in those next few minutes would shape how the young singer approached his career in Las Vegas for the rest of his life. He explained the unwritten rules, the power structures, the way respect flowed in that town. He told him about Frank Costello, about his reputation, about the bodies allegedly buried in the desert of men who'd crossed him. But he also told Elvis that he had nothing to worry about now because Dean had smoothed it over, he'd called in a favor, he'd essentially vouched for Elvis as someone worth protecting rather than punishing, someone who'd just made an innocent mistake out of ignorance rather than deliberate disrespect. And Costello had accepted that explanation because it came from Dean Martin, because Dean had enough credibility in that world to make those kinds of guarantees, and because Dean had also promised that Elvis would come by Costello's table after the show to pay his respects properly, to acknowledge the man's status, to show that he understood the lesson and wouldn't repeat the mistake. So that's exactly what happened. After Elvis had changed out of his stage clothes and composed himself, Dean walked him over to Costello's table personally, made the introductions with just the right tone of respect and casualness, and Elvis, to his credit, handled it perfectly. He was humble, he was respectful, he thanked Costello for coming to his show, he asked intelligent questions about Costello's businesses, his interests, showing genuine curiosity rather than fear, and something unexpected happened. Costello warmed to him. This mob boss who'd been ready to teach Elvis a violent lesson an hour earlier found himself charmed by the young man's genuine nature, his lack of pretense, his obvious love for music and performing, and by the end of their conversation, Costello was smiling. He was patting Elvis on the shoulder, he was telling him about Neapolitan opera that his mother had sung when he was a child, about the Italian crooners he'd grown up listening to, about how music transcended generations and cultures, and when Elvis mentioned that he loved gospel music and started talking about the spiritual roots of rock and roll, you could actually see Costello's demeanor shift from tolerance to genuine interest. Because here was this kid who wasn't just a performer but someone who understood music on a deeper level, someone who respected tradition while creating something new, and that was something Costello could relate to, that was something he could respect. The night ended with Costello telling Elvis that anytime he played Vegas, Frank would make sure to be there, and that if anyone gave the kid any trouble, he should let Frank know about it, and just like that, through a combination of Dean Martin's quick thinking and Elvis's natural charm, a potential disaster had been transformed into protection. Elvis had inadvertently gained the favor of one of the most powerful mob bosses in America, not through calculation or scheming but through authenticity, through his genuine love of music and his ability to connect with people regardless of who they were or where they came from. And Dean Martin, watching this transformation from adversary to ally, knew that Elvis was going to be just fine in Vegas, that the kid had something special, not just as a performer but as a human being who could navigate dangerous waters without losing himself in the process. The story of what happened that night at the Sands spread through Vegas like wildfire, though the details got distorted in the retelling. Some versions had Dean Martin punching out mob enforcers, others had Elvis staring down Costello in a battle of wills, but the people who were actually there, the ones who understood what had really transpired, knew that what Dean had pulled off was far more impressive than any physical confrontation could have been. He'd used intelligence, timing, personal relationships, and pure courage to defuse a situation that could have ended with Elvis Presley disappearing into the desert, and he'd done it without making anyone look bad, without humiliating anyone, without creating new problems while solving old ones. And that took a level of sophistication and street smarts that few people possessed. Elvis never forgot what Dean Martin did for him that night. In the years that followed, whenever they crossed paths in Vegas or Hollywood, there was a bond between them, a mutual respect that went deeper than professional courtesy. Elvis knew he owed Dean his career if not his life, and Dean, characteristically, never held it over him, never asked for anything in return, never even brought it up unless Elvis mentioned it first, because that's who Dean Martin was. He'd done what he did because it was the right thing to do, because he saw a talented kid in trouble and knew he could help, and because in Dean's code, which was shaped by his rough upbringing and his years navigating the treacherous waters of show business, you protected your own. You looked out for fellow performers, especially when they were young and vulnerable and didn't yet understand how the game was really played. The lessons Elvis learned that night served him well throughout his Vegas years. He became known for being respectful to everyone from the casino bosses to the cocktail waitresses. He always made a point of acknowledging the power players when they came to his shows, sitting down with them after performances, showing genuine interest in their lives, treating them like human beings rather than threats or obstacles, and this approach made him beloved in Vegas in ways that transcended his fame as a performer. He became part of the Vegas family, protected and valued, and much of that security can be traced back to that night at the Sands when Dean Martin's quick thinking transformed a potential enemy into a guardian angel. Frank Costello did indeed become one of Elvis's most ardent supporters. He came to see him perform whenever he was in town. He spread the word through his network that Elvis was under protection, and there's even evidence that when other criminal elements considered trying to shake down Elvis or muscle in on his Vegas deals, Costello let it be known that such moves would be considered personal affronts, and in that world, Frank Costello's displeasure was not something anyone sought, so Elvis performed in Vegas for years without interference, without the kinds of problems that plagued other performers, without having to deal with the darker elements that controlled so much of that city's entertainment infrastructure, and all because Dean Martin had the presence of mind and the courage to jump on stage during a performance and turn a confrontation into a collaboration. The story also reveals something important about the world Elvis was navigating, something that gets lost in the sanitized biographies and the Hollywood movies. The entertainment industry in the 1950s and 60s, especially in Las Vegas, was intimately connected with organized crime. The mob controlled the casinos, they controlled the bookings, they controlled access to the best venues, and performers had to navigate these relationships carefully if they wanted to work steadily and safely. It Wasn't enough to be talented, you had to understand the political landscape, you had to show respect to the right people, you had to know when to push and when to yield, and most young performers learn these lessons through harsh experience, through mistakes that cost them careers or worse, but Elvis learned them through Dean Martin's intervention. He got a crash course in Vegas politics without having to pay the price that ignorance usually demanded. Looking back on that night from the perspective of decades later, after both Elvis and Dean have passed away and Frank Costello has long since met his own end, the incident takes on an almost mythological quality. It represents the collision of two Americas, the one represented by Elvis Presley, young and optimistic and revolutionary, challenging every convention about music and performance and respectability, and the one represented by Frank Costello, old and established and powerful, built on violence and corruption and backroom deals, and the bridge between them was Dean Martin, who understood both worlds, who could speak both languages, who knew how to honor tradition while embracing innovation, and in doing so, he may have saved rock and roll itself, because if Frank Costello had followed through on his anger that night, if he'd made an example of Elvis Presley, it would have sent a chilling message to every young performer trying to break into Vegas. It would have established that the old guard would not tolerate being challenged or overshadowed, and the course of entertainment history might have been very different. Instead, what happened was a passing of the torch, orchestrated by Dean Martin, where the old power structure acknowledged and ultimately embraced the new, where Frank Costello, representing the establishment in all its dangerous glory, gave his blessing to Elvis Presley, representing the future, and that blessing allowed rock and roll to flourish in Vegas, paved the way for Elvis's legendary residencies in the 1970s, and established a template for how new generations of performers could work within the existing power structures rather than being crushed by them. The genius of Dean Martin's intervention wasn't just in the immediate moment, wasn't just in preventing violence through quick thinking, but in recognizing the larger historical forces at play and finding a way to reconcile them rather than letting them clash destructively. He saw that Elvis represented something that couldn't be stopped, that rock and roll was a genuine cultural revolution that was going to transform entertainment whether the old guard liked it or not. But he also understood that if that transformation happened through conflict and violence rather than negotiation and mutual respect, everyone would lose. The young performers would be suppressed or endangered, the old power structures would become increasingly irrelevant and bitter, and the audiences who loved both traditional entertainment and the new sounds would be forced to choose sides rather than enjoying the best of both worlds. So in jumping on that stage, in throwing his arm around Elvis, in smoothing things over with Costello, Dean Martin wasn't just saving one young singer. He was facilitating a cultural transition that needed to happen. He was being a bridge builder in the most literal sense, connecting generations and styles and power structures that might otherwise have remained forever at odds. This is the kind of story that reveals the real Elvis Presley, not the caricature of the sequined jumpsuits and the later years, but the young man trying to navigate an impossibly complex world, dealing with fame beyond anything anyone had experienced before, facing threats and challenges that had nothing to do with his music and everything to do with power and respect and the unwritten rules of a world controlled by dangerous men, and somehow managing to not just survive but thrive, to maintain his authenticity and his love of performance even while learning the harsh realities of the business he'd chosen. And he couldn't have done it without allies like Dean Martin, without people who saw his talent and his goodness and decided to protect him even when there was no obvious benefit to doing so, even when it meant putting themselves at risk, even when it required calling in favors and spending carefully accumulated political capital. The relationship between Dean and Elvis that grew out of that night became one of the great friendships in entertainment history, based on mutual respect and genuine affection, and whenever Dean was asked about it in later years, about the rumors of what happened that night at the Sands, he would just smile that famous Dean Martin smile and say something vague about how Vegas was a complicated place and Elvis was a good kid who just needed someone to show him the ropes. He never took credit, never made himself the hero of the story, because that wasn't his style. He just did what needed to be done and moved on. And that humility, that refusal to capitalize on his own heroism, makes what he did even more impressive, even more worthy of remembering and celebrating. So if you've made it this far in the story, if you're as fascinated as I am by these moments when history pivoted on individual acts of courage and quick thinking, then do me a favor, hit that subscribe button right now, because we have dozens more stories like this about Elvis Presley, about the king of rock and roll's life beyond the music, the real human moments that shaped the legend, the close calls and the triumphs and the relationships that made him who he was. And drop a comment below, telling me what you think about Dean Martin's intervention. Was it the greatest piece of crisis management in entertainment history, or do you know of something even more impressive? I want to hear your thoughts. I want to build a community of people who love these deep dives into Elvis's real life. Not the mythology, but the actual events that happened. And make sure you hit that like button, because it helps this channel reach more people who love Elvis Presley and want to know the true stories behind the icon, the moments that history almost forgot but that deserve to be remembered and celebrated. And stay tuned, because next week we're going to talk about another incredible incident from Elvis's Vegas years, something that will blow your mind about how he handled a completely different kind of threat, and you're not going to want to miss it. So subscribe now, turn on notifications, and get ready for more incredible stories about the one and only Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, whose life was even more dramatic and fascinating than any movie could ever capture. Thanks for watching, and remember, the real Elvis Presley was somehow even more impressive than the legend. He was a young man with extraordinary talent navigating an impossible world, and stories like this, stories about Dean Martin saving him from a mob boss at the Sands Hotel, remind us that behind every legend is a real person who needed help, who received it from unlikely sources, and who never forgot the people who stood by him when it mattered most.